Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the shadowy, often squalid corners of ancient Greece, a place where the yearning for lost loved ones was as potent as the Mediterranean sun. Imagine, if you will, the scent of olive oil mingled with sweat and the faint, unsettling aroma of decay, as desperate individuals, perhaps just like you, try to yank someone back from the ultimate vacation and spot the underworld. You're standing there, dust motes dancing in the last rays of sunlight filtering through a temple's columns, a deep ache in your chest for someone who's gone. You cling to every whispered rumour, every half-baked ritual, desperate for a sliver of hope. Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't have survived the attempt, let alone succeeded. The hygiene alone would have been a challenge. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always cool to see where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a resident of ancient Greece, and death isn't some abstract concept discussed in hushed tones in sterile hospital rooms. No, death is a visceral, ever-present reality. It stalks the unpaved streets, lurks in the shadows of the olive groves, and settles like a heavy shroud over every household. You've seen it countless times, the infant who doesn't cry, the warrior brought home on a shield, the elderly relative whose breath simply ceases. And with each passing, there's an immediate gnawing emptiness. It's not just the absence, but the fear of complete oblivion. For the ancient Greeks, the afterlife, specifically Hades, wasn't a place of divine judgment in the Abrahamic sense, nor was it a blissful paradise for the righteous. It was, overwhelmingly, a place of shadows, a land where the suchai, the soul of the dead, drifted like insubstantial wisps, stripped of their former vitality. Their memories often faded. Imagine standing at the edge of a freshly dug grave, the acrid smell of earth filling your nostrils. Your loved one, perhaps your spouse, your child, your parent, is being lowered into the ground. The wailing of the mourners is a raw, guttural sound that scrapes at your very soul. You reach out, instinctively, as if you could somehow pull them back, but your hand grasps only empty air. This is the moment when the impossible whispers begin. The logical part of your brain tells you it's over, that they are gone to Hades, that vast inescapable realm ruled by the grim god. But another, more desperate part, fueled by grief and denial, starts to entertain the truly absurd. What if there's a way? What if you could bring them back? The ancient Greek understanding of the afterlife was complex, shifting, and often contradictory. It wasn't a neatly codified theology like some later religions. Instead, it was a tapestry woven from myth, poetry, and local cult practices. Homer, the venerable bard whose epics shaped much of Greek thought, paints a rather bleak picture of the underworld. In the Odyssey, Odysseus journeys to the land of the Cimmerians, a perpetually misty and gloomy place, to consult the prophet Tiresias. Here, he performs a ritual to summon the shades of the dead. He digs a trench, pours libations of milk, honey, wine, water, and barley, and then sacrifices 2 sheep, letting their blood fill the trench. The shades, craving the warmth and life of the blood, flock to it. This scene, more than any other, cemented the popular image of necromancy, the supposed art of communicating with the dead, in the Greek imagination. But notice Odysseus doesn't bring anyone back to life. He merely converses with their faint echoes. This is a crucial distinction that many, in their desperation, chose to ignore. You might find yourself, in your grief, clinging to tales of heroes who ventured into the underworld. Orpheus, with his lyre's enchanting melody, famously charmed Hades and Persephone, almost reclaiming his beloved Eurydice. Heracles, in one of his labours, even dragged Cerberus, the multi-headed hound, up from the depths. These stories, however, were about unique, divinely favoured individuals, not ordinary mortals like you. They were exceptions, not blueprints. Yet, the sheer force of human longing made people look for loopholes, for a crack in the impenetrable barrier between life and death. The very concept of the Su-Che itself contributed to this yearning. It was believed to be a breath soul, an animating force that left the body at death. Without it, the body was inert, cold and lifeless. But if the Su still existed, even in a diminished form in Hades, couldn't it, theoretically, be reunited with the body? This was the flawed logic that fueled the desperate attempts. You'd hear whispers of certain places, dark caves or desolate groves, believed to be entrances to the underworld. These were often called Necromancy, places where one might attempt to summon the dead. Imagine the chills running down your spine as you approach such a place, guided by a local mystic or a shadowy figure claiming esoteric knowledge. The reality, of course, was far grimmer. The rituals, if you dared to perform them, were often crude and unsettling. We're talking about things that would make your stomach churn. Animal sacrifices, the spilling of blood, often on the grave itself, were common. This wasn't for some symbolic purpose. It was believed that the blood, brimming with life force, could temporarily invigorate the shades, allowing them to communicate. You'd find yourself kneeling in the dirt, the metallic tang of fresh blood in the air, chanting strange words you barely understood, hoping against hope that the faint rustling of leaves wasn't just the wind, but a sign. But even if a shade did appear, a faint, wispy image, what then? It wouldn't be the vibrant, laughing person you remembered. It would be a shadow, a memory, often unable to fully communicate, its voice a mere whisper. This is where the true horror set in. The realization that even if you could touch the fringe of the afterlife, you couldn't undo death. The Sush in Hades was irrevocably altered, a pale imitation of its living self, this universal historical fact. That death is a one-way street was as true in ancient Greece as it is today. You might hear tales of Asclepius, the god of medicine, who was said to have perfected healing to such an extent that he could raise the dead, but even he was struck down by Zeus's thunderbolt for disturbing the natural order. The gods themselves, it seems, were firm believers in boundaries. You might be wondering, why didn't people just accept it? Why endure such emotional and often physical torment for something so clearly futile? The answer lies in the profound human inability to accept ultimate loss. In a world without the same medical understanding or the modern concept of palliative care, death was often sudden, brutal, and unexplainable. It left gaping holes in families and communities. The desire to know if they were okay, to say one last goodbye, or simply to alleviate the crushing weight of grief, was a powerful motivator, one fascinating, yet morbid. Detail you'd stumble upon would be the use of defixiones or curse tablets, while not strictly about raising the dead. These lead tablets inscribed with curses were often buried in graves, near temples of chthonic deities, or at crossroads, places associated with the dead and the underworld. The idea was to enlist the powers of the dead or the underworld gods to enact vengeance or influence outcomes in the living world. You'd scratch out your enemy's name, or a rival's, and then specify the misfortune you wished upon them. You weren't bringing them back, but you were certainly trying to leverage their posthumous state. This offers a glimpse into how the Greeks viewed the dead as having some lingering power or connection to the world of the living, albeit a dark and malevolent one. However, despite these desperate attempts and the occasional success stories in myth, the overarching belief, the one that persisted in everyday life, was that Hades was a realm of no return. The ferryman Charon, with his obol for passage, ensured that once you crossed the Acheron or Styx, you were there for good, Scholars still debate whether the ordinary Greek truly believed in the literal effectiveness of necromantic rituals, or if it was more a desperate plea, a symbolic act of grief and defiance against the inevitable. There's no consensus, but the sheer persistence of these practices suggests that, for many, the hope, however faint, was real enough to try. So you'd try, you'd plead, you'd sacrifice, you'd perform your desperate rites. You might even feel a cold breeze, hear a faint whisper, or see a shadow coalesce in the dim light. Your heart would pound with a mix of terror and elation, but the moment would pass, the shadow would dissipate, the whisper would fade into the wind, and you'd be left alone, covered in dirt, perhaps a bit poorer from the cost of the sacrifice, and ultimately, just as heartbroken as before. The dead remain dead, firmly rooted in Hades, and your journey back to the living world would be one of quiet, profound disappointment. The only thing you'd bring back for sure was a deeper understanding of just how final death truly was. You're still standing there, perhaps in a quiet grove where the shadows stretch long and the air hangs heavy with the scent of pine. The failed attempt to commune with your lost loved one, or even just the stories of others' failures, have left you with a hollow ache, but the human heart is stubbornly hopeful, or perhaps just stubbornly desperate. So, even as the cold hand of reality tightens around your throat, you start to hear about the rituals of desperation. These aren't just polite mourning customs. These are often gruesome, unsettling practices, born from a profound, visceral need to breach the final barrier. And you, in your raw grief, might just be desperate enough to try them. Imagine, for a moment, that you're not just an observer, but a participant. The air is thick with anticipation, and a subtle shiver traces its way down your spine. You're guided by hushed whispers to a desolate, often hidden place. It might be a moonlit crossroads, a deep cave, or perhaps, most unsettlingly, directly over a fresh grave. The Greeks believed that certain places, especially those where the veil between worlds was thin, offered better chances. Crossroads, for instance, were liminal spaces, belonging to no one, and therefore potentially open to anything. The preparations themselves were often as unsettling as the rituals. You'd be told to fast, to abstain from certain foods, perhaps even to wear specific garments, often dark or unwashed, to symbolize your connection to the realm of the dead. Cleanliness, in this context, wasn't about hygiene, it was about ritual purity, or rather, intentional impurity, to align yourself with the chthonic forces. Imagine the days leading up to it, your stomach growling, your mind a swirl of hope and dread, the stench of your unwashed clothes a constant reminder of the task ahead. The core of many of these necromantic rituals revolved around blood. Why blood? Because it was seen as the very essence of life, the animating force that kept a body warm and moving. To the ancient Greek mind, a ghost, a souche, was a weak, faded thing, starved of this vital energy. The idea was that by offering blood, you could temporarily invigorate the shade, giving it enough strength to speak, to appear, or at least to acknowledge your presence. This wasn't some gentle offering of flowers. We're talking about animal sacrifice, often a black sheep or goat, animals associated with the underworld. You'd witness the throat being cut, the hot, crimson liquid gushing into a specially prepared trench or bowl. The smell, metallic and primal, would assault your nostrils, a stark reminder of the gravity of your actions. Think of Odysseus in the Odyssey, digging that trench, filling it with the blood of sacrificed animals. This wasn't just a literary device, it reflected a widely held belief. The shades of the dead flocked to the blood, drawn to its life force like moths to a flame. You'd watch, holding your breath as the blood pooled, perhaps seeing wisps of mist rising from it, or feeling a sudden drop in the temperature. Your mind, desperate for any sign, would interpret every shadow, every sound, as an indication of success. Alongside the blood, libations were crucial, not just water, but often honey, milk, wine, or even olive oil. These were offerings, meant to appease the chthonic deities, Hades and Persephone, who held dominion over the dead, and also to provide sustenance to the weary souls. You'd pour them, one after another, perhaps reciting ancient incantations, your voice trembling, hoping that each drop brought you closer to your goal. The stickiness of the honey, the rich aroma of the wine, all blending with the coppery tang of blood. It was a multi-sensory experience designed to amplify the sense of the sacred and the terrifying. But these rituals weren't just about offerings. They involved invocations and incantations. You wouldn't just show up and expect a chat. You'd need to address the gods of the underworld, the Furies, the various chthonic spirits, and of course, the specific shade you wished to summon. These were often long, repetitive chants, filled with obscure epithets and pleas, designed to compel the spirits to appear. Imagine trying to remember all those lines in the dark, your voice cracking with emotion. You'd hear strange, guttural sounds, perhaps the rattling of dried bones, a common prop for effect, or perhaps from an earlier, failed attempt, or the eerie silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. The effect was meant to be disorienting, unsettling, pushing you to the very edge of your sanity, blurring the lines between reality and hallucination. One particularly chilling detail you might encounter in some accounts, often from later periods or from more sensationalized texts, involved human remains. While direct reanimation wasn't the goal, some practices skirted dangerously close to it. The use of bones, hair, or even parts of a corpse was sometimes involved in more extreme forms of magic aimed at binding spirits or manipulating them. You can just picture the scene digging up a fresh grave under the cover of night. The metallic taste of fear in your mouth, the rustle of grave cloths, and the sickening thud of earth hitting wood. The idea here wasn't to put the soul back in the body, but to exert some sort of control or influence over it, or to use its power for a particular purpose. It's a grisly thought, and one that highlights the sheer desperation and moral boundaries that people were willing to cross. A common element in these attempts was the use of drugs or hallucinogens, while not explicitly mentioned in every historical account. It's highly probable that practitioners, whether genuine believers or charlatans, would use substances to induce altered states of consciousness in themselves or their clients. This could range from potent herbs burned as incense, their fumes inducing visions, to concoctions consumed before the ritual, the goal, to make the supplicant more receptive to visions, to lower their inhibitions, and perhaps to make them believe they were truly communing with the dead, even if it was just a trick of the mind. You might feel a lightness in your head, a disembodied sensation, the world around you shimmering and distorting. This blurring of lines between objective reality and subjective experience made the rituals incredibly potent psychologically. The practitioners themselves, often referred to as goets or magoi, were figures on the fringes of society. They weren't your respectable priests or philosophers. They were often viewed with suspicion, their practices bordering on impious, even sacrilegious. Yet in the times of extreme grief or need, people flocked to them. These weren't white-gloved doctors. They were often grimy, secretive figures, perhaps with piercing eyes and a strange, knowing smile. They might live in isolated dwellings, surrounded by strange herbs and talismans, and they certainly charged a hefty price, preying on the deepest vulnerabilities of their clients. Think about the psychological toll on you, the person desperate for a lost connection. You'd be pouring out your heart, your hopes, and your meagre savings into these elaborate, terrifying rituals. Each failed attempt would chip away at your spirit, leaving you more exhausted, more hopeless, and perhaps more deeply in debt. The emotional roller coaster alone would be enough to break most people. One academic debate that continues to this day is whether these rituals were primarily about genuine belief in the possibility of resurrection, or if they were a form of catharsis, a desperate attempt to process grief, even if it involved actions that seem utterly irrational to modern sensibilities. The line, for the ancient Greeks, was probably much blurrier than we imagine. So, you go through with it. You perform the sacrifices. You chant the incantations. You make the offerings. The air crackles with an unnatural tension. You might feel a gust of wind, even though there's none. You might hear a faint whisper, a barely audible sound carried on the night air. Your imagination, primed by grief and expectation, fills in the blanks. You might even see a fleeting shadow, a form that seems to coalesce in the darkness, a momentary flicker of recognition. Your heart leaps. Is it them? Have you succeeded? But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanishes. The whisper fades. The wind dies down. You're left alone, kneeling in the dirt, the lingering smell of blood and incense heavy in the air. The silence that follows is deafening. The chilling realization washes over you. Nothing has truly changed. The person you mourn remains in Hades. The ritual, for all its disturbing intensity, has accomplished nothing but to deepen your despair. You've crossed a line, done things you never thought you would, all for a fleeting glimpse of something that wasn't even real. The futility of it all is a cold, hard truth, far more painful than the most gruesome of the rituals themselves. You rise, dust off your clothes and walk away, leaving behind the remnants of your desperate hope, another testament to the unyielding nature of death in the ancient world. You've tried the rituals, you've knelt in the dirt, you've smelled the blood, and you've faced the crushing silence of failure. Yet, in ancient Greece, where answers were often elusive and the divine unpredictable, there were always those who claimed to have the secret. These were the necromancers, the goetes, the shadowy figures who promised to bridge the insurmountable gap between life and death. You, in your raw, unrelenting grief, might have sought them out, clinging to the desperate hope they offered, only to discover the stark reality of their futility. Imagine you've heard whispers of a certain individual, someone who dwells on the fringes of society, perhaps in a secluded dwelling near a sacred grove or a foreboding cave. They are rumoured to possess ancient texts, forgotten rituals, and a chilling intimacy with the powers of the underworld. Your heart pounds with a mixture of fear and reluctant hope as you approach their dwelling. The air around their abode feels different, heavier, perhaps even carrying the faint, unsettling scent of old herbs and damp earth. This person isn't a priest in a gleaming temple. They are often an outcast, someone who deals in the unclean, the forbidden. When you meet them, they might be shrouded in dark robes, their eyes perhaps unnaturally bright, or perhaps just weary from the years of dealing with the grief-stricken. They speak in hushed tones, full of cryptic pronouncements and vague assurances. They don't promise a full resurrection, not outright, because even they understand the deep-seated Greek belief that Hades does not release its dead. Instead, they promise communication. They promise a fleeting glimpse, a whispered word, a chance to ask a question, to gain closure, and in your desperation. Even that meagre offering feels like a lifeline. The tools of their trade would be fascinating, if not for their grim purpose. They might possess phylacteries, small pouches containing magical symbols or written spells, intended to ward off malevolent spirits or compel benevolent ones. You might see talismans made of bone or specific stones, believed to hold chthonic power. There would be bowls for libations, perhaps a sacrificial knife, and certainly a brazier for burning potent incenses, designed to alter perception and create an atmosphere conducive to conjuring. One common belief was that certain herbs, like mandrake or henbane, when burned or consumed, could induce visions or an altered state, making the necromancer or their client more receptive to spectral contact. The air would be thick with the acrid, cloying smoke of these burning botanicals, making your head swim and your eyes water. The ritual itself, performed by the necromancer, would be an elaborate performance. It wasn't just about chanting. It was a carefully choreographed display designed to awe and intimidate. They might draw magic circles on the ground, using chalk or ash, within which they would stand to protect themselves from potentially dangerous spirits. They would invoke deities associated with the underworld Hecate, the goddess of magic and crossroads, Hermes, the psychopomp who guided souls, and of course, Hades and Persephone. Their voices would deepen, becoming resonant and commanding, trying to project an aura of immense power. The problem, of course, was the inherent futility of their enterprise. Despite all the theatrics, the sacrifices, the elaborate invocations, the dead remained dead. The necromancer's successes were invariably vague, ambiguous, or easily explained away. A shadow flitting across the cave wall, a trick of the firelight, a rustle in the leaves, just the wind, a faint whisper, barely audible your own imagination, or perhaps the necromancer's muffled assistant. You'd hang on every word, every gesture, desperately searching for confirmation. The necromancer, being a cunning individual, would exploit this vulnerability. They might offer vague pronouncements that could be interpreted in multiple ways, allowing you to project your hopes onto their words. If you asked about a specific detail known only to you and the deceased, they would sidestep, claiming the spirits were uncooperative or that the message was unclear. This academic point, the ambiguous nature of prophetic utterances, is a recurring theme in ancient Greek literature. From the oracles of Delphi to these petty necromancers, think about the sheer economic exploitation at play here. These goettes were not altruistic spiritual guides. They were entrepreneurs of grief. They charged exorbitant fees for their services, demanding precious silver, valuable livestock, or even personal possessions. You, in your despair, would likely hand over your meagre savings, perhaps even go into debt, all for the fleeting promise of contact, or when the ritual inevitably failed to deliver the concrete reunion you craved. The necromancer would have a ready excuse: you lacked faith, the gods were displeased, or the spirit was simply unwilling. You, the client, would be left not only heartbroken but financially ruined. There were instances in Greek literature, even if mythical, of the dangers of dabbling in necromancy. Odysseus's journey to the underworld was perilous, not a casual stroll. The witch Circe warns him of the dangers, and while he converses with the dead, he doesn't bring them back, even in tragedies where ghosts appear, like Clytemnestra's shade in Aeschylus's Eumenides. They are not truly raised, they are apparitions, projections of guilt or divine will, not beings returned to life. This underscores the pervasive belief: once gone, they stay gone. The most famous Necromancy, or Oracle of the Dead, was at Acheron in Epirus. This wasn't some back-alley operation. It was a formal cult site, attracting pilgrims from across the Greek world, even here. The goal wasn't resurrection, but communication. Supplicants would undergo elaborate rituals, including purifications and sacrifices, before descending into a dark chamber to meet the shades. Modern archaeological excavations at the site have revealed complex underground passages and machinery, suggesting that some of the manifestations were likely elaborate illusions, perhaps using mirrors or even actors. You might enter, after days of preparation and deprivation, and in the dim, smoky light, see a fleeting form, hear a distorted voice, designed to convince you that your loved one was truly there. But even at this sophisticated cult site, no one ever walked out hand in hand with a resurrected family member. The illusion was just an illusion. Consider the societal role of these necromancers. They existed in a liminal space, simultaneously feared and sought after. They provided a service that the mainstream religious institutions couldn't, or wouldn't, while the Olympian gods dealt with civic life, war, and harvest. The chthonic deities and the dead were often the domain of these shadowy figures. They tapped into a deep human need that polite society often ignored: the raw, messy, and sometimes impious desire to defy death itself. The tension between popular piety and these fringe magical practices is a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of ancient Greek religion. Scholars still debate the extent to which these goetes genuinely believed in their own powers versus being cynical exploiters. It's likely a mix, with some truly deluded and others purely opportunistic. You, having gone through this harrowing experience, would emerge from the necromancer's lair with a sense of profound disillusionment. The fleeting hope that had propelled you there would have been extinguished, replaced by a bitter emptiness. The promises were empty, the rituals were futile, and the person you sought remained irrevocably lost to Hades. The necromancer, for all their supposed power, was just another mortal, albeit a morally ambiguous one, unable to defy the most fundamental law of existence. You would carry the memory of the unsettling sights and smells, the chilling incantations, and the stark, painful realization that for all your yearning, the dead were truly beyond reach. The experience wouldn't bring solace, it would only deepen the understanding of death's unyielding finality, leaving you with an even heavier heart and perhaps a significantly lighter purse. You've explored the desperate rituals, the shadowy figures claiming power over the departed, and each attempt has led only to the crushing weight of reality. The reason for this consistent, heartbreaking failure lies not with a lack of effort on your part, nor with the incompetence of the necromancer. No, the fundamental insurmountable obstacle was Hades, the unyielding keeper. For the ancient Greeks, the Underworld was a realm designed specifically to hold the dead, a one-way destination from which there was no true return. Imagine the Greek cosmos not as a simple flat earth, but as a carefully ordered structure. Above, the realm of the Olympian gods, bright and glorious. Below, the earth where mortals lived their fleeting lives, and deeper still, far beneath the deepest caves and the darkest seas, lay Hades, a vast, shadowy, and utterly inescapable domain. It wasn't a temporary waiting room, it was the final destination for every souche, every soul, regardless of their deeds in life. You didn't go there for judgment in the sense of eternal reward or damnation, as in some later religions. You simply went because it was your fate. The landscape of Hades was itself designed for permanence. Think of the 5 rivers that flowed through it, the Styx, the river of unbreakable oaths, whose waters were so fearsome even the gods swore by them, the Acheron, the river of woe, across which the ferryman Charon transported the dead, the Cocytus, the river of lamentation, the Phlegethon, the river of fire and the Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters could erase all memory of one's mortal life. Once your souche crossed these treacherous waters, once you paid the obol to Charon, a coin placed under the tongue of the deceased for this very purpose, you were irrevocably committed to the underworld. There was no swimming back against the current, no convincing Charon to turn his boat around. The ruler of this grim dominion was Hades himself, a formidable and largely unsympathetic deity. He wasn't evil, not in the sense of malevolence, but he was absolutely unyielding. His realm was his kingdom, and he guarded his subjects jealously. To release a soul back to the land of the living would be an affront to his authority, a disruption of the natural order, and beside him sat his queen, Persephone, often depicted as equally stern, especially in her role as queen of the dead. She was the one who had spent a portion of the year in the underworld, making her intimately familiar with its rules and its permanent nature. Consider the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. This is perhaps the most famous tale of attempted retrieval from Hades, and it perfectly illustrates the underworld's unyielding nature. Orpheus, a divinely gifted musician, charmed every creature, every god, even the Furies. With his mournful lyre, he managed to move Hades and Persephone to the point where they agreed to release Eurydice. But there was a single, non-negotiable condition. Orpheus could not look back at her until they reached the light of the upper world. One glance, and she would be lost forever. And what happened in his desperate love and doubt? He looked back, and she was immediately pulled back into the shadows, gone forever. Even for someone with divine favour and unparalleled talent, the rules of Hades were absolute. There was no second chance. This tale wasn't just a sad story. It was a powerful cautionary myth that reinforced the finality of death. It subtly reminded you, the ancient Greek listener, that if even Orpheus, with his God-given talent and the explicit consent of the underworld deities, could not truly succeed, then what hope did an ordinary mortal like you have? The answer was none. Another key aspect was the nature of the souche itself once it entered Hades. It wasn't a vibrant, conscious entity. Homer describes them as strengthless heads, apathees, carena, weak and insubstantial. They lacked memory and coherent speech until they consumed blood, as Odysseus provided, even after this temporary invigoration. They remained mere echoes of their former selves, incapable of true interaction with the living world. They didn't miss their old lives, didn't desire to return, and had no agency to do so. They were simply there, existing in a state of diminished consciousness. This is a crucial distinction. You weren't trying to bring back the person, but a faded copy, a ghostly imprint that barely resembled who they once were. This made the concept of raising the dead, in the sense of true reanimation, a non-starter. The very concept of Tartarus and the Elysian fields or islands of the blessed also highlighted Hades' permanent hold. While some souls might go to places of punishment like Sisyphus or Tantalus, and others to a more pleasant afterlife, these were still within the confines of the underworld. They were different compartments, not exits. There was no concept of a purgatory that allowed passage back to life. Once assigned, your place was fixed. This speaks to the unwavering conviction among the Greeks that the underworld was a closed system, designed for everlasting inhabitation, not temporary visitation. One fascinating but often overlooked detail is the concept of untimely deaths. Those who died young, or through violence, or without proper burial rites, were sometimes believed to linger closer to the world of the living, perhaps as restless spirits or even vengeful ghosts pharmakoi. This is where some of the more malevolent forms of magic, like the De Fictiones curse tablets mentioned earlier, came into play. But even these restless spirits weren't alive, they were still dead. Just unhappily so, unable to move on fully to Hades. You might hear stories of these lingering shades haunting places, causing misfortune, but never of them truly returning to their bodies and resuming their mortal lives. The distinction was subtle but critical. They were stuck between worlds, not returned to the living one. This nuanced understanding highlights the firm boundary that Hades represented, the lack of a strong resurrection motif in core Greek mythology, unlike in some Near Eastern traditions or later Abrahamic religions, is a significant academic point. While there are stories of individuals being brought back from the brink of death like Hippolytus by Asclepius, who was then punished by Zeus, full. Permanent resurrection after being in Hades is almost entirely absent. The consistent theme is that death is final. This absence speaks volumes about the pervasive cultural belief in Hades' unyielding nature. Historians still debate the precise reasons for this cultural difference, but its impact on the futility of necromancy is undeniable. So, when you stood there, desperately hoping for a sign, for a return, the unseen hand of Hades itself was the ultimate barrier. It was the vast, dark, unbreachable chasm that stretched between you and your lost loved one. No amount of blood, no chant, no desperate plea, no cunning necromancer could defy the will of the king of the underworld. His realm was not a place of transition, but of permanence, and in that chilling realization lay the true horror and futility of trying to raise the dead in ancient Greece. You walked away not just with grief, but with the profound and inescapable understanding that Hades kept its dead, and it kept them forever. You've grappled with the unyielding reality of Hades, a realm designed for permanence. So, if true resurrection was impossible, what then was the purpose of all those desperate rites and shadowy figures? The answer often lay not in bringing the dead back to life, but in seeking something else entirely, oracles and omens, not resurrections. The ancient Greeks were deeply superstitious and believed in a universe teeming with divine influence. They desperately sought guidance and foreknowledge, and sometimes they believed the dead, positioned beyond the veil of mortal understanding, could provide it. Imagine your life in ancient Greece. There's no Google, no weather forecast, no scientific method to explain the vagaries of life. Your crops fail, a plague sweeps through your village, your ship is lost at sea, or you face a crucial decision about marriage or war. Where do you turn for answers to the gods? Yes, through prayers and sacrifices at temples, but also to the earth, to the chthonic powers, and occasionally to those who had already passed beyond mortal concerns, the dead, having transcended earthly limitations, were sometimes seen as possessing a unique perspective, a window into fate itself. This is where the concept of the oracle of the dead Necromancy comes in. These weren't places for reanimation, they were sites where you could supposedly communicate with the futile of the deceased to gain prophecy or advice. The most famous was the one at Acheron, which we touched upon earlier, but there were others. You'd journey to such a site, perhaps over rough, dusty roads, driven by a profound need for guidance. It might be a dream, a premonition, or just the gnawing uncertainty of your present situation that spurred you on. Upon arrival, you wouldn't just walk in and ask a question. The process was elaborate, designed to be physically and psychologically taxing, ensuring that only the most desperate or devout would complete it. You'd undergo a period of purification, which could involve ritual bathing, abstention from certain foods, often meat, and avoiding sexual contact. This was meant to cleanse you of worldly impurities and make you more receptive to the spectral world. You might spend days, even weeks, in this preparatory phase, your body and mind becoming increasingly sensitive. Then would come the sacrifices, often of black animals like sheep, goats, or even sometimes pigs, whose blood would be poured into trenches or onto altars. This wasn't necessarily to empower the spirits for reanimation, but to entice them, to draw them close enough to communicate. The smell of burning fat and flesh, mingled with the earthy scent of the sanctuary, would fill the air, creating a potent primal atmosphere. You might be led through dark, winding passages designed to disorient you, to heighten your sense of anticipation and fear. The psychological manipulation was clear. Every step of the process was engineered to make you believe you were truly entering another realm. Once deep within the Necromancy, in a dimly lit chamber perhaps filled with smoke from burning herbs, you would finally attempt communication. The oracle or priest facilitating the ritual might act as a medium, falling into a trance and speaking in a distorted voice, claiming to channel the deceased. Or, in some instances, you might be encouraged to consume a substance or inhale fumes that induced a hallucinatory state, causing you to see or hear the shades yourself. The visions would be fleeting, the voices faint, often ambiguous, requiring interpretation. You might ask about the future of your family, the outcome of a legal dispute, or the most auspicious time to plant your crops. The answers, when they came, would rarely be clear. Direct pronouncements, For instance, you might inquire about your impending journey by sea. The oracle might respond with something cryptic like, "The sea holds both calm and tempest. The stars will guide, but the currents deceive." This isn't a yes or no answer, it's a statement that covers all possibilities, forcing you to interpret it in light of subsequent events. If your journey was smooth, you'd attribute the calm to the stars guiding. If you hit a storm, you'd remember the currents deceive. This is a classic characteristic of ancient Greek oracles. Their ambiguity ensured they were rarely proven wrong. This academic point, the carefully crafted ambiguity of oracular pronouncements, is a hallmark of ancient Greek prophetic traditions, whether from Apollo's oracle at Delphi or these chthonic ones. Beyond formal oracles, ordinary Greeks also sought omens and signs from the dead in less structured ways. Dreams, for instance, were often believed to be messages from the departed, or even direct visitations from the gods. If you dreamt of a deceased relative, you might interpret it as a warning, a blessing, or a message about your current life. You might try to induce such dreams through incubation, sleeping in sacred places, often near graves or in temples dedicated to healing deities, hoping for a prophetic dream. Imagine lying on a cold stone slab, the smell of damp earth in your nostrils, desperately trying to empty your mind and invite a vision. You might also seek divination through objects associated with the dead. This could involve observing the flight of birds near a graveyard, interpreting patterns in the ashes of grave offerings, or even reading the entrails of animals sacrificed at funerary rites. Each tiny detail, each subtle variation, would be scrutinized for meaning, twisted and turned until it fit your preconceived hopes or fears. You might also consult professional diviners who specialized in interpreting such omens, adding another layer of cost and potential deception to your desperate quest for answers. One peculiar practice, often found in magical texts, involved the use of corpse lamps or lights fueled by materials associated with the dead. These weren't for illumination, but for creating a specific atmosphere, or perhaps as a focal point for summoning. Imagine a small, flickering flame, casting eerie shadows, its fuel perhaps mixed with grave dust or the remains of funerary offerings. The sensory input, the flickering light in the absolute darkness, the strange smells, all contributed to a feeling of being on the precipice of another world, making you more susceptible to suggestion and self-deception. But what you consistently wouldn't get from any of these methods was a fully restored, living individual. The souche might whisper a cryptic warning, or a shadowy figure might appear in a drug-induced haze, but they remained firmly anchored in the realm of the dead. There was no physical interaction, no genuine reunion, no undoing of the finality of death. The goal was always information, guidance, or perhaps just a fleeting moment of connection, not resurrection. This inherent limitation highlights a crucial aspect of Greek belief. Death was a boundary, not a revolving door. You could try to peer through the keyhole, to hear muffled sounds from the other side, but you could never truly open the door and invite someone back. The dead were there to stay, and their wisdom, if it could be accessed at all, was filtered through the distorted lens of human interpretation and the necromancer's charlatanry. So, after days or weeks of ritual, after spending your last drachma, you would leave the Necromantion or the diviner's tent. You might carry with you a vague message, a feeling of unease, or perhaps a temporary sense of peace from having communicated. But the fundamental reality remained: your loved one was still in Hades, and you were still in the land of the living, burdened by your grief and the knowledge that some boundaries, even for the most desperate heart, could simply never be crossed. The omens were just omens, and the oracles spoke in riddles, never in definitive pronouncements of life returned. You've explored the desperate attempts to communicate, the vague prophecies, and the unyielding nature of Hades. Now, let's talk about the crushing personal and societal burden you, or anyone trying to raise the dead in ancient Greece, would have carried This isn't just about a failed ritual, it's about the price of the impossible dream, a cost that extended far beyond a few coins to a dubious necromancer, impacting your well-being, your reputation, and your place in the community. Imagine the psychological toll. You've lost someone you deeply love, your world is fractured, and your grief is a raw, open wound in this vulnerable state. You embark on a quest that defies the natural order of the universe. You subject yourself to unsettling rituals, perhaps involving blood and darkness. You exhaust yourself physically with fasting and travel. You subject yourself to the manipulations of shadowy figures who exploit your pain. Each failed attempt, each ambiguous whisper, each glimmer of false hope followed by crushing disappointment, would chip away at your sanity. You would be perpetually cycling through hope, desperate effort, and profound despair, a truly exhausting and soul-destroying loop. Consider the financial ruin. These services weren't free. The necromancers, the guets, the priests at the Necromancy, they all demanded payment. Whether it was a black goat for sacrifice, precious silver coins, or even valuable family heirlooms, the cost would quickly mount. For an ordinary Greek citizen, living a precarious existence, this could mean draining your life savings, selling off inherited land, or plunging yourself deep into debt. You might face the prospect of poverty, of being unable to feed your remaining family, all because you chased an impossible dream. This wasn't just a hypothetical. Many accounts, even fictional ones, emphasize the vulnerability of those seeking such services to financial exploitation. Beyond the immediate financial drain, there was the social stigma. Engaging in necromancy was not a mainstream, respectable activity, while mourning was a public and communal affair. Attempting to bring back the dead crossed a line. These practices were often viewed with suspicion, bordering on impious or even sacrilegious. The gods, particularly Hades and Zeus, were believed to uphold the natural order of life and death. To defy this order was to invite divine displeasure, perhaps even a curse. You might be ostracized by your community, whispered about behind your back. Your neighbours might avoid you, fearing you'd brought ill fortune or angered the gods. Think of your reputation. You'd be known as the one who tried to raise the dead. This wouldn't be a title of honour or respect. It might lead to accusations of witchcraft, of dealing with dark powers, or simply of being utterly mad with grief, in a society where reputation was paramount. Such a stigma could ruin your prospects, making it difficult to find a spouse, conduct business, or even participate in civic life. You might find yourself isolated, alone with your grief and your impossible obsession. There was also the very real danger of physical harm. Many of these rituals were performed in remote, desolate locations, far from the safety of the police. You might be vulnerable to bandits, wild animals, or even the trickery or violence of the necromancers themselves. The substances used, whether for fumigation or consumption, could be harmful. You might suffer from poisoning, hallucinations, or even permanent mental impairment. Imagine staggering back into your village, physically weak, mentally unmoored, and financially destitute. The cost was far more than emotional. Consider the disruption to the grieving process. Grief, though painful, is a natural and necessary process. It involves acceptance, remembrance, and eventually finding a way to move forward. By desperately clinging to the idea of bringing someone back, you would actively resist this process. You wouldn't allow yourself to fully mourn, to come to terms with the loss instead. You'd be trapped in a cycle of longing and false hope, prolonging your agony indefinitely. You would be unable to find peace, constantly haunted by the what-ifs and the allure of an impossible reunion. This prolonged, unhealthy form of grief is an often overlooked consequence of such attempts. One particularly poignant detail in ancient accounts, often found in philosophical critiques of magic, is the idea of false hope. It's not just that the dream was impossible, it's that it preyed on the most vulnerable. It offered a tantalizing vision of undoing the ultimate loss, only to snatch it away. This act of repeatedly raising and then crushing hope would leave you more devastated than if you had simply accepted the initial loss. The necromancer, in this sense, was a cruel illusionist, not a healer. This is a subtle yet profound academic point, the ethical implications of offering false hope in the face of insurmountable odds. The pursuit of raising the dead also diverted energy and resources from more practical and beneficial activities, instead of investing in community projects, strengthening family bonds, or engaging in productive labour. You would be pouring your resources into a futile endeavour. This could weaken your family unit, your household, and even the broader community if enough individuals were caught in this snare of impossible dreams. Furthermore, there's the philosophical and theological cost. By trying to subvert the natural order, you were effectively challenging the gods. While the Greeks had a complex relationship with their deities, often trying to influence them, outright defiance of fundamental cosmic laws was generally frowned upon. You risked incurring divine wrath, not just from Hades, but from Zeus, the king of the gods, who maintained diet justice and cosmic order. This underlying fear would undoubtedly add another layer of anxiety to your desperate quest. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about just like that? This was a solution that seemed plausible in a world without scientific understanding, but ultimately offered no real benefit and carried significant risks. The pursuit of raising the dead was far more damaging, leaving you not just sunburned, but utterly broken. Ultimately, the price of trying to raise the dead in ancient Greece was devastating. It wasn't just the monetary cost, but the profound psychological scars, the social isolation, the physical dangers, and the lingering despair that came from confronting death's absolute finality again and again. You would walk away from such attempts not with a restored loved one, but with an emptiness far deeper than the original grief, compounded by ruin and regret. The impossible dream, it turns out, was a nightmare in disguise. You've endured the psychological and financial toll of your futile quest, having learned that Hades keeps its grip tight. So, if direct resurrection was impossible and communication often an illusion, what exactly were those shadowy figures doing with their strange implements and whispered incantations? This brings us to magical practices and mortal limits, the fascinating array of spells, tools, and beliefs that populated ancient Greek attempts to manipulate the forces of life and death, and why they invariably fell short of actual reanimation. Imagine a world where magic isn't just fantasy but a perceived reality, interwoven with everyday life. It's not the grand, spectacular magic of modern fiction, but rather a more mundane, often localized, and deeply personal set of practices. You, desperate for a connection, would encounter practitioners who claim to harness the power of specific objects, words, and rites. Their goal wasn't to bring a full, breathing human being back to life that was universally understood to be beyond mortal capabilities, but to influence, to gain insight, or to cause harm using the lingering power of the dead. One of the most common and intriguing magical artifacts you might encounter were curse tablets, or deficciones. These were typically small sheets of lead, often folded or rolled up and pierced with a nail, then deposited in graves, wells, or chthonic sanctuaries. While not about raising the dead, they aim to bind or incapacitate an enemy, or influence a legal case or sporting event. By invoking the power of underworld deities or the restless spirits of the dead, you'd scratch your enemy's name into the soft lead, perhaps with a symbol or a crude drawing, and then add a short, often vicious, imprecation: bind so-and-so's tongue in the courtroom, or may so-and-so's limbs be cold and lifeless. The idea was that the spirits of the dead, being closer to the chthonic powers, would carry your curse to the gods below, or even enact it themselves. The very act of burying it in a grave was a symbolic plea for the deceased's intervention. The language of these tablets was often formulaic, full of voces mysticae, mysterious, often untranslatable words or sequences of letters believed to hold inherent power. These were not meant to be understood by humans, but by the gods and spirits they addressed. You would see them used not just on deficciones, but in other spells too. Imagine the necromancer muttering these strange sounds, their voice a low, rhythmic drone, trying to evoke a sense of the arcane and the powerful. Then there were the charms and amulets. These weren't typically for raising the dead, but for protection against malevolent spirits or for personal well-being. But in the context of necromancy, you might see necromancers or their clients wearing them as a form of protection against the very spirits they were trying to summon. They could be made of various materials, bone, specific stones, or even papyrus inscribed with magical symbols or short spells. You might be offered one by a necromancer, perhaps for an extra fee, a piece of carved bone meant to ward off the chill of the underworld. The use of magical knots was also prevalent. These were believed to have binding power, to tie up or restrain something. In the context of the dead, this could mean binding a restless spirit to a particular place, or even to prevent a spirit from leaving the underworld. Imagine seeing a necromancer tying a complex series of knots from string or hair, each knot a segment of a spell, drawing on the idea of physical and metaphysical entanglement. Potions and incenses were a staple. We touched upon the use of blood, but think about the concoctions for inducing visions or creating a specific atmosphere. Herbs like hemlock, mandrake, or opium poppy were known for their psychoactive properties. When burned as incense, their fumes could induce altered states of consciousness, making a client more susceptible to suggestion and hallucination. When brewed into a potion, they could lead to vivid, unsettling visions, blurring the line between subjective experience and objective reality. You might be given a small, bitter draught to drink, its taste acrid and earthy, followed by a dizzying sensation and a heightened sense of perception. A key element in all these magical practices was the belief in sympathetic magic. This is the idea that like affects like, or that parts can represent the whole. This is why you'd find the use of human remains, hair, fingernails, grave dirt, or even pieces of bone in some rituals. The idea wasn't to put the soul back into that piece of bone, but to use the fragment as a magical conduit, a proxy for the entire deceased individual, to influence their lingering souche or tap into the power of their death. The presence of these morbid ingredients was meant to create a direct link to the realm of the dead. It's a grisly thought, to think of someone sifting through grave dirt, but it speaks to the depth of belief in sympathetic connections. However, despite this elaborate arsenal of magical tools and practices, the mortal limits remained absolute. No matter how many deficciones were buried, no matter how many amulets were worn, no matter how potent the potion, a dead person remained dead. The souche that flitted around in Hades, if it could be perceived at all, was a mere shadow, incapable of regaining its full life force or reanimating its former body. The Greeks, despite their belief in magic, understood that there were fundamental boundaries that even the most powerful spell could not cross. The very fact that Orpheus, a legendary figure, failed to fully retrieve Eurydice served as a potent cultural reminder of this ultimate limitation. One fascinating but underexplored academic area is the role of astrology in these necromantic practices. While not as dominant as in later periods, the positions of stars and planets were sometimes consulted to determine the most auspicious time for a ritual, particularly one involving chthonic powers. Certain constellations or planetary alignments were thought to open specific windows for interacting with the dead. This adds another layer of complexity to these practices, showing how different streams of ancient thought converge in the desperate pursuit of the impossible. The stories of mythical figures with healing powers, like Asclepius, who could supposedly raise the dead, were seen as divine exceptions, not human attainments. Asclepius was a god, and even his ability to reanimate was deemed a transgression by Zeus, who struck him down. This divine intervention and subsequent punishment reinforced the idea that resurrection was a power reserved for the gods, and even then, only under specific circumstances and with severe consequences. It wasn't something mortals could simply conjure. So, while you might find necromancers meticulously preparing their lead tablets, burning their strange herbs, and chanting their esoteric phrases, the ultimate outcome was always the same: a profound sense of failure in the face of death's finality. These magical practices might offer a psychological outlet for grief, a sense of agency in the face of helplessness, or even a fleeting, drug-induced hallucination of contact, but they could never, and did never, truly raise the dead. The mortal limits were simply too absolute, and the magical tools, for all their unsettling mystique, were utterly useless against the unyielding laws of the underworld. You would walk away with a deeper understanding of the grim truth. Some things, even with all the magic in the world, are simply beyond your grasp. You've explored the rituals, the charlatans, and the magical tools, all of which pointed to one unassailable truth: death in ancient Greece was final. This grim reality stands in stark contrast to humanity's deepest desires, leading us to consider the tension between philosophical acceptance versus mortal yearning. While philosophers grappled with the nature of existence and the inevitability of death, the everyday person, like you, was often consumed by a raw, primal longing to defy it. Imagine, for a moment, sitting in the agora, listening to a stoic philosopher calmly discourse on the nature of fate and the acceptance of what cannot be changed. They would speak of ataraxia, a state of tranquility achieved through freedom from disturbance, which included accepting death as a natural part of the logos, the universal reason. Or perhaps you'd hear an Epicurean arguing that death is nothing to us, for when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. These philosophical schools, though vastly different in their approaches, shared a common goal to liberate individuals from the fear of death, largely by encouraging rational acceptance of its finality. This philosophical perspective, however, often felt miles away from the visceral, gut-wrenching pain of personal loss. You might intellectually grasp the arguments of Seneca or Epictetus, nodding along as they eloquently explained why grieving excessively was irrational, but then you'd return home, to an empty house, to the silence where a loved one's laughter once echoed, and all that carefully constructed philosophical acceptance would crumble in the face of raw, human emotion, the yearning for reunion, the sheer inability to reconcile with complete and utter absence was a powerful, driving force. It wasn't just about curiosity, it was about love, attachment, and the terror of oblivion. You might find yourself, despite all rational thought, wishing for a single touch, a final conversation, a moment to say goodbye that was never afforded. This deep-seated emotional need often trumped any intellectual understanding of death's inevitability. Think of the elaborate funeral rites themselves, while they concluded with burial, marking the finality of death. They also served as a profound expression of grief and a way to honour the deceased. The lamentations, the public displays of sorrow, the washing and anointing of the body, the funeral procession, all these were ways to process loss, but they also hinted at the difficulty of letting go, the very intensity of these rituals, often lasting for days, speaks to the immense emotional weight of death in ancient Greek society, even in seemingly rational customs. The threads of yearning were deeply woven. The Greek concept of the psyche as a breath soul that continued to exist, albeit in a diminished form, in Hades, also fueled this yearning, if part of the person still existed, even as a shadowy echo, then surely there was a chance to connect. It wasn't about the body, which was clearly decaying, but about the essence, the identity, this belief, even if it led to a bleak underworld. Paradoxically kept the hope of some form of continued existence alive, and therefore the desire for interaction. Contrast this with the philosophical push towards rationality and control over emotions, while philosophers preach detachment from external goods, including loved ones. The common person clung to them fiercely. They built their lives around family, community, and the tangible world. The abstract notion of death as nothing to us might appeal to the intellectual, but for the one whose child had died, it was everything. This tension between elite intellectual thought and popular belief is a recurring theme in any historical study. The average Greek farmer or artisan wasn't spending their days debating metaphysics. They were struggling with the practical realities of life and death, and often sought comfort in less abstract, more immediate solutions, however futile. One common, though often unacknowledged, aspect of this conflict was superstition, despite philosophical pronouncements. Common people often resorted to apotropaic magic to ward off evil, charms, and folk remedies for everything from illness to bad luck. It's no great leap to see how this reliance on practical, if unproven, solutions would extend to the realm of death. If you could hang an amulet to ward off a fever, why couldn't you perform a ritual to bring back a soul? The logical leap, while flawed, felt entirely consistent within their worldview. This blend of rational inquiry and pervasive superstition defines much of ancient Greek daily life. Consider the role of personal piety versus formal religion. While the official state cults focused on public sacrifices to the Olympian gods for the benefit of the polis, personal piety often involved more intimate, chthonic practices, including ancestor worship or rites at graves. These individual devotions were expressions of profound personal connection, and they often involved attempts to appease or honour the dead, sometimes blurring the lines into attempts at communication. The yearning was so strong that it pushed individuals beyond the conventional boundaries of religious practice. An interesting academic discussion point arises from the question of free will versus fate in this context. If death was fated, as many Greeks believed the moirai, or fates, spun out each person's destiny, including their death, then trying to reverse it was not just impossible, but a direct defiance of fate itself. Yet, the human desire for agency, the stubborn belief that one can somehow alter their destiny, continue to drive these desperate attempts. This intellectual and emotional tug-of-war illustrates the deep complexity of Greek thought on life and death. So, while the philosophers might tell you to accept death with equanimity, to recognize it as a natural end, your heart would ache, your spirit would rebel, you'd find yourself drawn to the illicit, the desperate, the seemingly impossible. You would cling to every rumour of a way back, every fleeting shadow of hope, even as your rational mind told you it was foolish. The conflict between your philosophical understanding and your raw, human yearning was the true tragedy. You might know, deep down, that it was futile, but the sheer force of your love and grief would compel you to try anyway, paying the heavy price of prolonged anguish for the ephemeral promise of an impossible reunion, and in that relentless pursuit, you would find not peace, but a deeper, more profound exhaustion, a testament to the unbridgeable chasm between intellectual acceptance and the aching human heart. You've explored the chasm between philosophical acceptance and raw human yearning, a chasm that fueled countless desperate acts, and as you tried to bridge this gap, you would inevitably stumble upon stories, ancient tales woven into the very fabric of Greek culture that echoed your own desperate quest. These are the echoes in literature and legend, where the recurring motif of attempted necromancy and its consistent failure serves as a powerful, enduring reminder of death's finality. Imagine yourself sitting by the hearth on a cool evening, listening to an elder recounting tales of old. You'd hear about heroes, gods, and mortals who dared to venture into the underworld or try to summon the dead. These weren't mere fantastical adventures. They were narratives that shaped your understanding of the cosmos, of divine power, and of human limitations. And in almost every instance, the outcome for those attempting to truly reverse death was failure, or a fate worse than death itself. The most prominent example, one you've encountered before, is Orpheus and Eurydice. This myth isn't just a romantic tragedy, it's a profound statement on the unyielding nature of Hades. Orpheus, with his lyre's divine music, performs an act of necromancy in its purest form. He persuades the gods of the underworld to release a soul, but the condition that he not look back is the ultimate test of faith and restraint, and his failure to meet it reinforces the idea that even divine permission can't fully circumvent the laws of death. His gaze back, a moment of human doubt and yearning, irrevocably seals Eurydice's fate. The story doesn't end with a joyous reunion, it ends with him losing her again. A second, deeper heartbreak that underscores the absolute finality of the separation. This myth was a cultural touchstone, a constant reminder that if he couldn't do it, no one could. Then there's the famous journey of Odysseus to the land of the Cimmerians to consult the prophet Tiresias in Book 11 of the Odyssey. This is arguably the foundational literary depiction of necromancy in Western literature. Odysseus digs a trench, sacrifices black sheep, and calls forth the shades. They are described as strengthless heads, mere insubstantial images, only able to speak after drinking the blood. He sees his mother, Anticlea, and tries to embrace her 3 times, but she passes through his arms like a shadow or a dream. This scene is incredibly poignant because it highlights the physical impossibility of interaction. You can't touch them, can't hold them, can't truly communicate beyond a whisper. The purpose of this visit is prophecy, not reanimation. Tiresias gives him advice for his journey home, but never once does Odysseus consider taking his mother, or any other shade, back with him. The narrative implicitly accepts the dead's fixed abode in Hades. Even the mighty Heracles, in his 12th labour, ventures into the underworld to capture Cerberus. He successfully brings the hound of Hades back to the upper world, a feat that showcases his incredible strength and divine favour. But notice he doesn't bring back any human souls. His mission is specific to a monstrous beast, not to defy death for a human being. The myths carefully delineate what even the greatest heroes can achieve. They can raid Hades, but they cannot reverse its fundamental function. You might also encounter plays, particularly tragedies, where the concept of ghosts or shades appears. In Aeschylus's The Libation Bearers in Eumenides, the ghost of Clytemnestra appears, driven by the Furies to hound her son Orestes. This is a spectral manifestation, a projection of vengeance and divine will, not a resurrected individual. She is a powerful, terrifying presence, but she is still fundamentally dead, unable to interact with the living world in a tangible way. Her appearance serves a dramatic purpose, often to illustrate the consequences of bloodshed, rather than to suggest that the dead can return to life. The souche is still a souche, not a body re-inhabited. One fascinating literary detail, often debated by scholars, is the distinction between a true souche soul and an eidolon phantom or image. Sometimes, particularly in early poetry, the shade of a dead person is referred to as an eidolon, suggesting it is merely an image or an echo, not the full essence of the person. This reinforces the idea of diminished existence in Hades, making any attempt to bring them back seem even more futile. The academic discussion around the precise meaning of these terms highlights the nuanced, and sometimes contradictory, Greek beliefs about the nature of the soul after death. Consider also the stories of mythical figures who received divine punishment for overstepping their bounds. Asclepius, the god of medicine, was so skilled that he could reportedly raise the dead in some versions of his myth. But Zeus, angered by this disruption of the cosmic order, struck him down with a thunderbolt. This myth explicitly states that even divine power cannot defy death without severe consequences. It's a clear message, mortals, and even some gods are not meant to tamper with this fundamental law. These literary and legendary examples served as cautionary tales, deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness. They were not tales of triumph over death, but of its enduring power. They showed that grief was natural, but defying the natural order was dangerous and ultimately futile. You would hear these stories from childhood, shaping your understanding of the world, even as your heart longed for a different outcome. They solidified the understanding that Hades was a realm of no return, a place from which only the gods could briefly extract an individual, and even then, with strict, often tragic, conditions. So, as you return from your own failed attempt at necromancy, the echoes of Orpheus's mournful lyre, the insubstantial embrace of Odysseus's mother, and the vengeful cries of Clytemnestra's shade would resonate in your mind. These stories, familiar from your youth, would now carry a new, bitter significance. They wouldn't offer comfort, but rather a chilling validation of your failure. They were the cultural memory, the collective understanding that, no matter how desperately you yearned, the dead remained in their shadowy realm, forever beyond your grasp. You've embarked on this winding journey through the desperate attempts of ancient Greeks to defy death, from the blood-soaked rituals to the empty promises of necromancers, always confronted by the unyielding gates of Hades. You've heard the echoes in their myths, all culminating in the same inescapable truth. Yet, despite millennia of consistent failure, humanity's fascination with overcoming death, the persistent dream of immortality, remains as potent today as it was in the dusty streets of ancient Athens. Imagine, for a moment, shifting your gaze from the ancient world to our own. We no longer sacrifice black goats on moonlit graves, nor do we consult shadowy figures in a smoky cave. Yet, the fundamental human yearning to escape death, to reverse it, or at least to prolong life indefinitely, persists with an intensity that would make any ancient Greek recognize our shared condition. We've simply traded arcane rituals for scientific laboratories, and whispered incantations for complex algorithms. Consider the enormous resources poured into modern anti-aging research. Billionaires fund biotech companies striving to extend human lifespan, perhaps even achieve what they call longevity escape velocity, a point where scientific advancements can extend life faster than time passes, theoretically leading to indefinite life. We talk about gene therapy, CRISPR technology, organ regeneration, and even cryonics, freezing bodies in the hope that future technology can revive them, while not raising the dead in the ancient Greek sense. It's a modern iteration of the same deep-seated desire to cheat death, to push back against its finality. You might hear headlines about breakthroughs in regenerating tissue or combating age-related diseases, and a tiny, ancient part of your brain, the part that yearns for lost loved ones, whispers, what if the ancient Greeks believed in a distinct separation of body and souche? For them, the souche was the vital essence that departed at death, leaving the body a mere shell. Our modern scientific pursuit often focuses on the physical body, on repairing its damage and maintaining its functions, almost as if to prevent the souche from ever having to leave. We're trying to make the vessel so robust that the breath soul never escapes. This is a profound shift, but the underlying motivation to keep the individual intact and present is identical, even in our entertainment. The dream persists. Zombie apocalypse narratives, once niche, have become a global phenomenon. What are zombies, if not a horrifying, grotesque form of raised dead? They represent the ultimate violation of the natural order, a macabre fulfillment of the ancient necromancer's wish, albeit in a terrifying, brain-eating form. We are fascinated by what happens when the boundary between life and death is breached, even if it's in a nightmarish scenario. This constant presence in our pop culture indicates a persistent, perhaps subconscious, preoccupation with the very questions the ancient Greeks wrestled with. Think about the way we deal with grief today, while we have therapy and support groups. The initial, raw pang of loss is universal. We still visit graves, we still talk to photographs, and many, in their private moments, still wish for one last conversation, one last hug. The technology might be different, but the emotional landscape is startlingly similar. We might not try to summon a ghost with blood, but we might pore over old videos, reread old messages, or listen to their favourite songs, trying to conjure their presence in a different way. The underlying human need for connection, even after death, is unshakable. One fascinating academic discussion point that crosses millennia is the definition of life and death. For the ancient Greeks, the souche leaving the body defined death. For us, with advances in medical science, the lines are increasingly blurred. When is someone truly gone? When their heart stops, their brain activity ceases, can consciousness be uploaded? These are questions that the Greeks never had to contend with in a scientific sense, but their philosophical debates about the nature of the soul and the afterlife were their version of our quest for definitions. The question of whether a living, breathing body with an absent souche is truly raised, or just a reanimated shell, is a timeless philosophical puzzle. The allure of immortality, whether through scientific breakthrough or mythical resurrection, speaks to a fundamental human fear, the fear of oblivion. The ancient Greeks, for all their acceptance of Hades, still grappled with this. They sought chaos, glory, and time honour in life, hoping to achieve a form of immortality through fame and memory. Knowing that physical life was fleeting, our modern obsession with leaving a legacy, with creating digital footprints that outlive us, is a direct descendant of this ancient desire to be remembered, to defy ultimate erasure. So, as you reflect on the futile attempts of the ancient Greeks to raise their dead, recognize that their struggle is, in essence, our struggle. The tools and beliefs have changed, but the fundamental human condition, our vulnerability to loss and our relentless desire to overcome it, remains constant. The dream of immortality, of reversing death, has persisted through countless civilizations, adapting its form but never losing its grip on the human imagination. And perhaps, as you drift off to sleep tonight, you'll find a strange comfort in realizing that you're part of a timeless human story, a story of longing and resilience in the face of the ultimate unknown. The air around you has grown still, the distant echoes of ancient laments and desperate incantations fading into the background hum of the night. You've walked alongside the grief-stricken, witnessed their futile struggles, and understood the unyielding nature of Hades. But now, as the final chapter unfolds, let's step back from the raw desperation and consider the ultimate, quiet truth that the ancient Greeks, in their own way, came to terms with the acceptance of finality and the ways they found solace beyond the impossible dream of resurrection. Imagine the dawn breaking over the Athenian Acropolis, painting the marble with hues of rose and gold. Life, despite its fragility, continues. Crops grow, children play, and the rhythm of daily existence reasserts itself. For most ancient Greeks, after the initial, overwhelming wave of grief and perhaps a brief, misguided foray into the shadowy world of necromancy, they had to return to this reality. They had to find ways to honour their dead, remember them, and integrate their loss into the fabric of their lives, without clinging to the fantasy of their return. This acceptance wasn't passive resignation, it was often an active process of remembrance and honouring. Funerary monuments were central to this. You'd see beautiful gravestones, or stelae, depicting the deceased in familiar, everyday poses: a warrior, a mother, a child, often with inscriptions that evoked their virtues, or a simple farewell. These weren't just markers, they were focal points for memory, places where the living could visit, offer libations, and feel a connection to their ancestors. The act of tending the grave, placing offerings of food or flowers, was a tangible way to maintain a relationship with the departed, acknowledging their presence in memory, if not in life. The annual festivals and public rites also played a crucial role in societal acceptance of death. The Anthesteria, for instance, was a spring festival dedicated to Dionysus, but it also involved a day when the dead were believed to wander the earth. While some elements were about warding off malevolent spirits, others were about communal remembrance and acknowledging the cyclical nature of life and death. The city itself participated in this collective remembrance, reinforcing that death, while painful, was a shared human experience that everyone would eventually face. This communal aspect helped individual mourners to not feel so isolated in their grief. Philosophically, as we touched upon, thinkers encouraged a form of Stoic acceptance. While the common person might not have recited Epictetus, the underlying sentiment of accepting what cannot be changed permeated society. The emphasis shifted from defying death to living a virtuous life, achieving arete, excellence, and leaving behind a good kleos, glory or renown that would ensure one's memory endured. This was a form of symbolic immortality, living on through one's deeds, one's children, and the collective memory of the community. It wasn't a physical return, but a profound way of acknowledging that some part of a person could transcend their biological end. Consider the role of heroes and cults of the dead heroes. Figures like Achilles, despite their mortal ends, achieved a form of immortality through their epic deeds and the stories told about them. Heroes were often believed to have powerful sutai that lingered and could influence the living, usually from a specific sacred site associated with their burial or cult. People would pray to them, seek their blessings, and offer sacrifices. This was not about bringing the hero back to life, but about harnessing their continuing influence from the realm of the dead. It demonstrated that even in death, some individuals could maintain a form of beneficial connection to the living, not by returning, but by enduring as powerful spirits. An academic point that often arises is the nuanced understanding of the suche itself. While it was a breath soul, there was a spectrum of belief about its activity in Hades. For Homer, it was largely insubstantial. Later mystery cults, like the Eleusinian Mysteries or Orphism, offered a more hopeful, if still ethereal, afterlife for their initiates, sometimes even promising a blessed existence. But even in these contexts, the return was usually spiritual or symbolic, not a physical reanimation. The promise was of a better afterlife, not a reversal of death. Scholars continually debate the precise nature of the hope offered by these mystery religions. Was it truly for a better individual fate, or for a more profound connection to divine truths? The practicalities of life also forced acceptance. You couldn't spend your entire existence trying to resurrect the dead. There were farms to tend, battles to fight, families to raise. The very demands of survival grounded people in the present. Grief would soften with time, transforming from an acute agony into a more bearable ache, a fond memory tinged with sadness. This natural process of healing, combined with the social support systems of mourning, eventually led to a quiet, often unspoken, acceptance of death's finality. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen. It was a desperate, unproven remedy for a minor discomfort. Trying to raise the dead was a far more desperate and ultimately devastating. Attempt to cure the profound discomfort of ultimate loss, the ancient Greeks eventually learned, through countless failures and centuries of tradition, that some things simply cannot be fixed, and must instead be endured and accepted. So, as the sun sets on your journey through ancient Greek notions of death, you find yourself in a quieter place. The terrifying spectre of the necromancer and the gruesome rituals fade. What remains is a profound understanding of human resilience, the ability to grieve deeply, to yearn fiercely, but ultimately to find peace in acceptance. The dead, for the ancient Greeks, truly remained in Hades, but their memory lived on, carried by the living, honoured in ritual, and preserved in the stories that remind us all of life's precious, fleeting nature. And now, good night, and have sweet dream.